today I'm going to be speaking about Ubuntu and AI, and I'm going to speak specifically about conceptual disruption. Just a bit of a warning. Let me just get my slides here. A bit of a warning. I will be discussing things like sexual harassment. I will be focusing on the concept more than the content of sexual harassment. So I'll be speaking about how language functions and how language changes, and I'm going to use examples like sexual harassment. So just be aware of that. That will start in section 3 of the presentation if you want to skip that. And then, I mean, I did say something about me, but let me tell you a bit about myself. So I'm Kristy. I've got degrees in journalism, philosophy, and theology, as Amina also mentioned earlier. I'm currently working in the Netherlands at the University of Twente, and I'm focusing on how technology is shaping our concepts and our foundational values and beliefs. Now, all of this is, I guess, interesting, but this is not the full story, of course. I'm quite interested in Ubuntu and the philosophical and ethical framework of Ubuntu. And the reason for this is quite a personal reason. I grew up in South Africa during the transition from the apartheid regime to a democracy, and Ubuntu played such a big role in this transition that since I was quite young, this topic has been interesting to me on both an academic level and a personal level. So for today, let me just get back. I'm going to speak about Ubuntu. I'm going to give a general overview. I'm not going to go into much depth with this. I'm going to give a broad outline, and then I'm going to speak about AI values and some of the work I'm doing there. And then I'm going to speak about conceptual disruption. Now, a big question is, how do we implement or apply values to things like AI? I'm going to mention some things there, but I think that this idea of conceptual disruption is something that's important. It's quite a new topic of study, and I think we should pay attention to this. I think this is something important that we have to keep in mind when we think about AI and the values that we want AI to embody. Okay, at any point you can pause me and ask questions. So let's start firstly with a general overview of Ubuntu. So of course there are many linguistic variations of the word, but there are also nuances in the way that it's being used. Of course, Africa is quite big. There's quite a couple of different approaches. So I'm going to be focusing specifically on the literature as it's been researched in South Africa. So that's just my kind of point of departure. So I'm just saying this is a small part of the discourse. There's much more that we can speak about, but this is the kind of approach that I'm using. I'm focusing more on Southern Africa, South Africa specifically. Now, about Ubuntu, you might have heard this term, I am because we are, that John Beatty, who's a theologian and a philosopher, used to describe Ubuntu as a worldview, right? Now, this is not incorrect. I think I am because we are is a good summary, but there's a lot more to Ubuntu that we need to consider when we want to speak about Ubuntu and how to apply it to technology and how to understand the kind of values that you find within an Ubuntu philosophical or ethical framework. So let's briefly look at Ubuntu, right? Now, I think there are a couple of different schools of thought that you can identify within Ubuntu. And I'll go into more detail for each of these. Now, a very important remark or something to keep in mind here is Ubuntu has been around for a long time, but the discursive spaces, so the universities and academic journals and the places where Ubuntu was academically studied only really opened up in the 1980s, of course, because that is when a lot of the, decolonization of Southern Africa happened, and that is when Ubuntu became more academically studied. So you'll see from the 80s onwards, there's a lot more research and literature being published just because these spaces were closed off for a very long time. Now, in the 1980s, I don't want to give away my age, but I was quite young, but this is where the interest in Ubuntu really started. So people like Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela spoke about Ubuntu, and at this time there was so much optimism about Ubuntu. Right, this is a period in Ubuntu scholarship also where you find a lot of hopefulness and, like I said, optimism. Also, as a way to kind of heal the country in the case of South Africa. So Ubuntu was seen as a framework that could really help us with reconciliation. Of course, it played a big role in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee as well, or Commission. But this was kind of where it started. This optimism about Ubuntu, and that it will all the things that it will help with. Now, also around this time is when the scholarship about Ubuntu took an ontological turn. And let me explain that a little bit. So ontology is about being, to put it simply. In philosophy, there's this part of philosophical study where the focus is on being. And in the 1980s, especially with scholars like Mokgobo Ramose, he's seen as a leader still today in Ubuntu scholarship, this question of what it means to be was central in Ubuntu. So to give you an idea, in African philosophical systems, in many other indigenous knowledge systems as well, what you are dictates your ethics, right? Now, this might seem to a lot of us very obvious, but in some Western systems, the ontology and the normativity, so to be and how you act, are not as closely related as in African philosophical systems. So this is where Ubuntu kind of really, the scholarship started. The ontology. What does it mean to be someone with Ubuntu? What does it mean to act in ways that portray yourself as someone that has Ubuntu? Now, like I said, Mokgobo Ramose was the leading figure here, and he had a couple of things to say. You'll see that he splits Ubuntu into two things, Ubu and Ntu. And in the word itself, Ubu refers to generalized being, and Ntu to this particular being. Okay, so basically what this means is that in an Ubuntu worldview, there is this being that exists that we all share, but each individual person or entity kind of, portrays something about generalized being in the particular. Okay, so for someone like Ramose, the word itself says something about Ubuntu. So Ubu always relates to Ntu. There's always this kind of interrelation between being as a whole and the specific being in which you and I or anyone in which we find ourselves, right? So our entire being is this kind of process of trying to be interconnected with the other, I guess you can say. Now, for Ramose, and this is we can discuss this in the end because this is of course a whole big topic. But for Ramose, this also included. Sorry, let me just close this. This also includes generations that are still to come, so future generations, and the generations that came before us. So relationality in Ubuntu is what I would call radical relationality, right? It's relationality beyond your own generation. Now, already here, we can start asking some questions about ethics and values. So if you are someone who subscribes to an Ubuntu worldview, right? Already when you look at the ontology, you are going to be asking questions like, what happens to future generations because of the technologies that we put into the world? So the focus here, and I know in Western philosophy and in Western ethics, we are starting to see this focus on future generations more, but it's much more pronounced in Ubuntu philosophy. So this was the first kind of generation, this idea of, or this question of what does it mean to have Ubuntu? And Archbishop Desmond Tutu also always phrased it this way. He would say, oh, here's a person with a lot of Ubuntu, right? So that's someone who relates to the community and takes part in the community, etc. So the first ontological part to remember is there's this idea of relationality that is quite radical, that extends beyond only the way that you relate to other people. It extends to your environment, and it even extends to the generations that came before you and the ones that will come after you. Okay, so this was in the 1980s. Then the next kind of wave or school of Ubuntu thinking was this normative school, right? And this is specifically people like Thad Metz, who is now, I think, at the University of Pretoria. But basically what happened here is in philosophy, there's been a lot of system building. So big ethical systems, deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, these big systems of thinking about ethics. And there was this question of, does this exist within African ethical systems, and specifically Ubuntu ethical systems? And during this time, there was a lot of focus on, so what makes Ubuntu unique, right? What differentiates it from other ethical systems? And this one paper that Thad Metz wrote in 2007, it's called Towards a Moral Theory, if I remember correctly. Here he looked at ways in which an Ubuntu ethical system differs from other ethical systems. So for instance, in an Ubuntu system, you would seek consensus above whatever the majority votes for, right? So it's not necessarily just a democratic system. You would have conversations, you would have, quite long deliberations until everyone agrees on a point. So there's already a difference in the way that things are done. So there is a focus in Ubuntu communities on reconciliation above retribution. This you see in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. This is also quite a big topic. Then also there are things like, creating wealth on a cooperative basis instead of a competitive basis. Then I'm going to go through them quickly. I'll discuss a bit more. Then there's this idea of the distribution of wealth should be based on needs and not on rights. So in the Western thinking, you have rights. In Ubuntu-centered, you have needs. So for instance, let's say someone is very poor, that would be the person whose needs are higher, and that is the first person or the person that should receive wealth or whatever the community has to offer. Then another very important part is acknowledging tradition, partaking in rituals, and then another one is creating a family. So anyone who has grown up in Africa knows this is quite important. You are expected, it is seen as a duty to create a family, right? And this also links with the ontology, because in the ontological system, the focus is on the coming generations. So for there to be coming generations, you have to create a family, right? So these are some of in the normative schools, some of the things that Ubuntu philosophy, it's not saying that you don't find any of this in other systems. Like, it's not like an East or Africa West comparison, but these are much more pronounced in African societies or Ubuntu practicing societies, I would say. Then the third wave, and this was from, I would say, 2010 onwards, is this critical wave that started. And this was Prof. Bernard Matalino wrote this article on the end of Ubuntu. And he argued that, look, so let me read this quote. If Karl Marx was correct in opining that the basic structure of all society is its economic premise, then we can ask ourselves, what exactly are the economic commitments of Ubuntu? So Prof. Matalino asked questions like this, where he was critical of the role of Ubuntu, because if you look at just the inequalities in a country like South Africa, for instance, his question was, where is Ubuntu then, right? So these more critical kind of voices that I think is, also a powerful way to kind of understand Ubuntu. These kind of critical perspectives started developing from 2010 onwards. You also had people like Leonard Prague, who spoke about the the way that Ubuntu has just recently, or during that time, become sentimentally reduced to everything nice, right? So this was also a time where you'd see all these kind of business books about how to use Ubuntu to grow your business, So there was also a critical kind of response to this. This is also the period where you saw more environmental philosophers using Ubuntu to speak about, for instance, when it comes to nuclear waste, what would the impact of that be on future generations? So intergenerational justice, especially when it comes to the environment, became a topic during this time. And I need to slow down. I tend to speed up when I'm speaking. But also, this is also where you started seeing many feminist kind of approaches to Ubuntu develop, and being critical on some of the hierarchy. So this was the three main phases, I think, of Ubuntu as a philosophical and ethical system. And we are, I think, now in this fourth school of thinking. So we have, over the last, 45, that's a long time. The 1980s was a long time ago. But over the last years, we have, Ubuntu has been studied much more rigorously, and we have learned a lot about the theory and it's developed. But now we are at this point where the question is becoming, how do we apply these values and the things that we know Ubuntu teaches to technology, for instance? And this is why now you see a lot more research being done on things like care robots. You see also in places like social work, in legal studies, there's much more of an application of distilling the values and the things that we have learned over the last years into a more kind of applied way, right? And this is, of course, what we are doing today with AI. So we are asking the question, how can we use Ubuntu to, I think, create better AI or to evaluate artificial intelligence systems, right? Though not just evaluate, but implement. So this is where I think we are in the fourth school, where we are taking a lot of these insights from the previous schools and applying it. So from the ontological school, we think about relationality and we think about coming generations, and from the normative school, we think about, like what specific values are important. Okay, let us carry on. Now this, I'm going to go a little bit into my own research. So the difficulty here with the fourth school, and I'd be interested to know if you've also experienced this, is now we have all these values, right? We understand that Ubuntu promotes relationality, a focus on future generations, all these different kind of things. But how does that exactly relate to AI? Because here's the problem. So let's say you have a technology like geoengineering. Which specific values should we be applying to that technology? Just, we can't just say, oh, we're just applying all the values of Ubuntu to this. No, because certain technologies raise questions about certain values, right? So for instance, when we speak about big data, then values like privacy is something that is considered more important. When we speak about, whatever the technology is, it raises specific values. So now the question is, how do we translate the values that Ubuntu promotes to AI? And this is, I think, quite a difficult question, because as you'll see in the next part of the presentation, when I speak about conceptual disruption, technologies shape values. Our values don't remain static. So Ubuntu values also don't remain static, but values don't remain static. So I was speaking about privacy. Our ideas about privacy was much different 50 years ago to what it is today, right? So this is the question. When we are speaking about AI and AI ethics, and we look at AI ethics through this lens of Ubuntu, which values are the ones that we should be focusing on? So I took my own approach to this. I looked at Ubuntu. These are the values in the global discourse. This was already in 2022, so this should have changed by now. But this is in the research, the values that most attention is being paid to at the moment. And the bigger ones are the ones that had the more articles written about them. So in the global discourse, things like transparency, privacy, accountability, fairness, autonomy, explainability, these are the values that that we're seen as essential. Now I know there's also there's actually two sets of values here. There are contextual values and there are values that focus on the technology's robustness itself. But for now, let's just look at all the values. So in the global discourse, these are the values that are seen as the most important and the ones that are being researched most and the ones that are being applied to technologies most, right? Now, the question is, of course, is this the case for people who subscribe to an Ubuntu worldview? So what I did is I conducted a bunch of surveys and focus groups to just speak to people and see, but what are the values that you find most important for AI systems? And these were specifically people who self-identified as I am Ubuntu practicing, right? This is the worldview that I grew up in. This is plays a role in my decision making. And in the focus groups, they were also very adamant that Ubuntu, underlies all of these values that they think are important. So in my research, for instance, I found. But in my research, okay, so you'll just have to believe me here. But in my research, I found, let me go back to the previous slide. I found that in Ubuntu practicing communities, the number one value was data security, right? So this is quite interesting, and I think this is of course contextual because our regulation is not as, I think, strong as what you would find in other communities. So data security was the most important one. Privacy was really high. And then also human dignity was one of the values that was much higher than you would find in the global discourse. So this is it becomes clear that Ubuntu prescribes a set of values that are seen as central that does not necessarily align with the global discourse, right? So now we have to start asking the question, when we create technologies for African Ubuntu practicing people, what are the values that these technologies should embody? So, so like I said, I'll see at the end of the Q&A if I can see why this picture is not showing. But yeah, it's different to the ones that we see in the global discourse. There's much more focus on privacy, data security, transparency is there, but also human dignity is quite important. This is just on a side note. This was not the focus of my study, but it was quite interesting also to see in this Ubuntu, this group of people who see themselves as Ubuntu practicing. Yeah, you can see a bit. Data security was the top one, human dignity, privacy. But look, for instance, at responsibility. There were some interesting differences between the male and female respondents, right? So for women who I interviewed and spoke to, responsibility was much more important. So I'm basically looking at the group as a whole, but I think this is an interesting avenue for study that hopefully I'll be able to pursue later on, where something like responsibility is much higher. And I think, yeah, I also did this study in European context, so there were some interesting differences that kind of repeat the difference between the global discourse and the one that I've seen in Ubuntu communities. Now, I'm quickly going to speak about implementing the values. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there's a lot of discussion on when we are designing technologies, how do we design these technologies to embody specific values? Now, there's value-sensitive design that's been around since the 80s. There's the guidance ethics approach. So I also teach design ethics at the university. So there's all these different kind of the ethical cycle or the ethical design cycle, the Markula toolkit that they used a lot in Silicon Valley. So there's different ways to try and implement these values in the technologies that we create. Now, this is I'm not going to give any easy answers here, like which one should you use, which one is the best. I think this depends on, if you are designing AI technologies, it depends on your context, the company, what kind of design, ethical frameworks you have in mind. If you don't have one, like look at these approaches. But there are different ways to try and implement these values. But the point I want to make today, the main point I want to talk about today is the following. It's not only about which values, but it's about what those values mean. Okay, so it's not only about, so now we have the set of values that we know is important when it comes to AI. The argument I'm making is that it's not only about those values, but that we should interrogate the meaning of those values. Now, let me speak about conceptual disruption for a bit. Now, it's going to seem completely unrelated. Hopefully in point 4, you will see that these two things belong together. Now, with conceptual disruption, what does this mean? So basically, like I said earlier, moral concepts change over time. So for instance, privacy. Back in the day, privacy meant that, people shouldn't, film you in public or whatever. Now we have informational privacy, and we have tons of information about ourselves that we want to keep private. So there's a difference in the technologies that were introduced, the technologies that make it possible to keep track of large amounts of data, changes the concept, changes the value, right? We can speak about value concept as well. Now, conceptual disruption is what happens when there's an interruption in the normal functioning of a concept. So maybe our value of, I'm using privacy all the time, but you can use autonomy, you can use explainability. There's a couple of different values that you can use, but I like the example of privacy. So privacy, 100 years ago, the concept functioned in a specific way. When we used it, when we employed it, it had a specific meaning. It referred to, specific kinds of things that we thought should be private or not. But with the introduction of certain technologies, this concept shifts, right? So for instance, take autonomy. With the introduction of artificial intelligence, I even see my students speaking about, autonomy. Am I writing this paper, or is it ChatGPT, or is it both of us, right? And you also find this with not just with value concepts, with any concept. So our concept of intelligence now does not only include biological intelligence, right? Biological beings that can be intelligent. So the concepts that we use, the values that we use, are shifting, are changing because of the introduction of new technologies. So like I said, it spans many domains beyond technology. But in the last couple of years, because technology is having such a big impact on human life, we are looking more at how technology changes concepts. So there's a lot of examples. So we speak about socially disruptive technologies often. So for instance, with robotics, if you kick a robot, is that assault? Does it still work, right? When we geoengineer our environment so that it rains, for instance, what does that mean when it comes to concepts like control? Because in the past, we had certain concepts of control, but now we have different kind of technologies that gives us power over things that we might not have controlled in the past. Same thing with genome editing. Also with artificial intelligence, concepts like natural or artificial, control, autonomy, these concepts are shifting in meaning. Okay, so this is a bit of just an introduction to conceptual disruption. There are different kinds also. So for instance, you get conceptual gaps. So when the mechanical ventilator was introduced, right, for the first time in human history, you could have someone who is, physically, their body is alive, but their brain is not. So what concept do you use to describe that? So the point here with gaps is that new technologies are being introduced and we are creating new concepts to kind of express our experience, if that makes sense. So you also get overlap. This is quite an extreme example, but they use it a lot in the literature. If there's a humanoid robot, right, and let's say a sex robot, and a person has a relationship with that robot, is it adultery or masturbation, right? So sometimes the words that we do have, like, there's an overlap. So it might overlap with these words, but it's not exactly that, right? So we are creating new words, or the words that we have are changing to fit our experience of technology. The final one is misalignment, and there's also a bunch of a whole bunch of examples. But for instance, if you have a humanoid robot, or even I know you get these kind of chatbot kind of friends like Replica and other kind of friends that you can have. Is that friendship? Does that accurately explain our relationship to the technology? So if you remember none of these things, the point that I'm trying to make here is that because of the introduction of new technologies, the values and the concepts that we used up until this point, they are shifting, and they are not always adequately describing what we are experiencing. So we are either disrupting that word and what the word means is changing, or we are just creating new words. Like artificial intelligence is a new concept, right? That we created to fill this gap for something that we really didn't have the concepts for. So what is happening with artificial intelligence is we have these values, we have these concepts like, autonomy, like intelligence, like I guess privacy you can add. We have these concepts that are shifting meaning, right? Let me give you another just way of thinking about this. This is Miranda Fricker. She's a philosopher, and I think we have time, so I'm just going to go over the main points of this quote of hers. But basically, in the late 60s, this woman, Kamita Wood, was being sexually harassed at work, but extant hermeneutical resources did not enable her to experience this lucidly for what it was. So I know this is kind of crazy to believe, but the word or the concept of sexual harassment did not exist until the 60s, late 60s, right? So what happened here is this group of women, they didn't have the concepts to describe what they are experiencing. So what they did is they got together, they created a safe discursive space in which to explore these experiences and find a way of interpreting them that rendered them more fully intelligible, and also help them express the experiences that they were having. Now, this is also in the philosophy of technology research. There's also this discussion on hermeneutic injustice, right? So what is happening is in the global discourse, there is, like I've shown you, a focus on certain values that are important, that reflect the experiences of people, that reflect the things that people want to see in technologies. These values are, of course, shifting and changing. But the problem, of course, is that there is a small minority of people developing these concepts and deciding on which concepts are important, right? So in the global discourse, I've shown you the Ubuntu communities and the global discourse, those two, there's a bit of a misalignment there. So basically what I'm saying here is when it comes to conceptual disruption, concepts are being developed and used in ways that do not reflect the experience of the majority world, of the people using these technologies. Okay, and that's why I think in AI ethics, we should start paying much more attention to not just the values that we should be putting in technologies, but what those values mean and how they function in a specific community. I'm gonna start speeding up a little bit here. And this is why I think that when we speak about AI ethics, we should also focus on disruption and the disruption of concepts. And we should start asking questions when it is just a given that privacy, I'm not going to go into this, I would rather have a bit of a discussion. But when we speak about privacy, this concept was introduced into African contexts in a way that was not known to the people, that did not reflect or mirror the experience of the people using this concept, right? So when we are asked to create technologies and evaluate them and design them so that they reflect certain values, the only thing I'm saying, the only thing I'm arguing for in this talk is let's ask, like, what do you mean by this value? Does it reflect the experience of the community who will be using this technology? Now, I know this is kind of a big ask because, it means that there's still a lot of research that needs to be done on which values are being disrupted and how people experience them. But I think already, we should start also disrupting concepts. And also when we find these concepts that are disrupting our experiences, through technology, we should start also asking, but, we should start being disruptive and ask, but what does this concept mean? Does autonomy, so for instance, and I'm almost done, but there's a Professor Polycarp Ekenube works on the idea of autonomy in Ubuntu communities or in African communal systems. And if you live in an African community, autonomy is always intertwined with your community, right? So autonomy has a different meaning to what we might find in the AI ethics literature. So I think that is me for today. I hope this makes sense, what I'm trying to say here. But basically, let's question the concepts. Let's question whether those concepts align with our own lived experience in places where these technologies and these narratives are not being created. I think that's it. My email address is there if you want to ask me some questions or if you send some resources. But any questions or comments? I know that's a lot of stuff that I shared there.
Thank you so much, Kristy. That was really, really informative and very rich. As Lay Miller said, hands down, the best weak word in here, sorry, presentation I've seen about AI in years. And I think I agree. A lot of the times, there's a lot of blurred sort of conceptualization of how these topics kind of speak to one another. But I just perhaps want to kick off the conversation and Q&A, and please everyone feel free to contribute and ask questions as well. Is, when you say that we should focus on the values, but also what they mean and align on them, I'm really wondering about whether you've thought around how do you actually bring people to align on what values mean? And what kind of exercise does that look like for a design team, for an engineering team? And I know you've worked with engineers as well. So how do you kind of, create that space where people can elaborate or deliberate, or sorry, the word is gone, but deliberate about the meaning of values?
So I kind of made my own method here a little bit. So in my research, I was really struggling to find a way to do exactly that, to figure out which values are the most important. So A little bit about my study. So I first had these surveys to see, just to see which values people think are important, kind of to sensitize myself also towards which values are problematic, right, or are central. And then I had these different focus groups where so what I did, and yeah, there's a lot more behind the scenes going on here. But what I did is I basically created this method of value mapping. So I would ask people to create use index cards and create like a hierarchy of which values they think are most important, which that is not important, but what I did find important is the way that they negotiated the values. So in these groups, people would speak about, okay, I think privacy is the most important one. And then you'd hear this conversation on what privacy means and why it's important and why it's important to the specific technology. So that's how I try to get a bit to the concept. So hopefully I'll be able to practice this method out, like, or try it out more often. But that was really useful to me, because not only did they give me an idea of like what they found, and these I had different groups, but now I'm thinking specifically of the group I identify with Ubuntu as a worldview. So I would ask, so they would have privacy was one of the top ones, and at first human dignity was a bit lower than I found in the surveys, and I asked them, but what about human dignity? And they explained to me, quite in line with the literature, that in Ubuntu, human dignity, responsibility, integrity, these things all kind of hang together. And this is why this value was higher up than the other one. So that's how I personally did it. I had focus groups and discussions where I literally had people explain to me and articulate and negotiate these different values so that I could understand what they mean with it and not necessarily what the literature says it is, because the literature is way more vague than you would expect on what those values actually mean.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. That's very clear. Um, if I wanted to. And I guess I just want um, to kind of ask you about examples of AI designs or AI conceptualizations or AI or tech inventions where you've seen Ubuntu at play and that you would recommend that people kind of look at for inspiration.
So, are you talking about like where Ubuntu values were employed? So I think what you
More
also,
or less, yeah.
yeah, I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. So a lot of AI technologies are transferred to African context, right? So this is the first. So then I don't think we are speaking about which values to implement. Then we are speaking more about using the values to assess the technology and its impact, right? So there's a couple of different layers at work here. So I think, on the one hand, there are existing technologies that need to be evaluated using these concepts and these values, right? On the other hand, you get design processes. I don't know of any like where people have used, like you see in value sensitive design or the design cycle or guidance approaches. I've not yet seen places where technologies have been developed from scratch very intentionally along these lines. So, I mean, I would hope to see that in the future. Of course, I would hope to see that, in different kind of organizations, that designing along Ubuntu values becomes a more central concern. But yeah, I think you see technologies that embody certain kind of elements, but as a novel technology, I haven't really, that I can think of, seen technologies that were invented specifically using an Ubuntu design framework, because this framework has not really it's not been entrenched in the discourse yet, right? People don't necessarily, I think, see the importance of designing using Ubuntu values, I don't know. Do you think there are any examples?
No, personally, not that I can think of either, but I think you're also saying something really important, which is that um, uh, the lack of taking Ubuntu seriously in
Yeah,
AI design, I
yeah,
think also has to do with perhaps the reductionism of it being one sentence that is, I am
mm,
because we are, and I think you've
yeah,
outlined quite clearly that it's much broader than that. The work
yeah,
of the philosophers you've shown, the work of Motsamai Molefe, like there's so much
yeah,
literature that really demonstrates how large Ubuntu philosophy is and how to break it down to actual values that one can work with and perhaps quantify in some ways
yeah.
if if AI is about numbers and zeros and ones, how to kind of
I,
embed that and code it into a design.
I think
Um,
I think that's a bit like maybe I think that's a bit intentional, right? So this is why I like the critical school, because even if you look at the normative kind of aspects of Ubuntu, something like value sharing. So if we go to OpenAI or Google or whatever big multinational kind of corporations we have now, Facebook, if we go to them and we're like, look, one of our core values is that value is being shared, that any wealth created by this product should be shared by the community. I doubt that they want to hear that, right? So there's also this element where I think we need to really start taking things like so it's very easy for the world, kind of, I've seen this in a lot of literature, for the world to take Ubuntu as, community and love and hospitality. But as soon as they get to the more critical part of, hey, maybe you should talk about the value that you've created in this community for yourself, and that should be shared, benefit should be, and wealth should be shared with the people where this wealth is created, then people shy away, right? Then businesses don't necessarily like jump at the opportunity to find ways to share their wealth. So I think that's why we need to be very clear that Ubuntu is not just love and peace and happiness. It is, okay, I'm reducing it, but it's not just the beautiful, the nice things. There's also this element of like it does ask something, it asks of the designers of these big tech companies to put the community before the individual. And honestly, I don't think they always want to hear that.
yes, and I think Leigh Muller also agrees. I think she says, and more Ubuntu designers, maybe different people at the development table. And she says, thank you so much. Yeah, in terms of the multidisciplinary kind of outlook of the team, do you think that could impact sort of an Ubuntu-driven tech future? And
Multi
how do you?
multidisciplinary multidisciplinary teams. Oh yes,
Mhm.
of course. I absolutely. So today I'm supervising a student for the first time, and the student is working on game design. And this student has, like, I'm a philosopher, right? So we come from completely different worlds. And just the kind of interactions that we have about the student designing this specific thing and what should be taken into account, that's been already such an enriching experience, this kind of colliding of worlds. So I mean, I'm absolutely, I know it didn't come through in the presentation, but having teams, I mean, look at the difference even within Ubuntu communities, when it comes to kind of different genders and how they experience it. And in the interviews, this came across so clearly, where a lot of the women said, but you don't understand privacy and what it means, and if someone shares your information online, and how scary that can be. And if we have those conversations kind of already in the design phase, like, how incredible would that be, right? To get these different. So I'm absolutely for that. I'm just, where I get stuck is, how do we get these companies to listen, right, and to implement that kind of thinking, and to be open to the kind of critiques that Ubuntu raises, because Ubuntu, for me personally, is also, there's a lot of like anti-capitalist sentiments, right? And like I said, not everyone is as open to hearing those kind of critiques. But yes, multidisciplinary teams, 100%. I think because of the hermeneutic injustice that someone like Fricker speaks about, there's no way that, a group of designers that have the same kind of world experiences could design, for communities that they don't share experiences with.
Completely. I don't know if anyone else has a question. Yumiko or Richard, please feel free to unmute and ask. But I just wanted to say that I also really appreciated the critical kind of perspective that you brought, which is the necessity to have or to evaluate all the technologies that are coming into the continent
Yeah.
through like Ubuntu frameworks and philosophies, because that would enable us to kind of see how to fill in the gaps and how some of these technologies are in fact like harmful
Yep.
to the collective welfare. Just thinking about health, I think the alienation and the lack of communal kind of experience of care is really felt very deeply, and there's nothing to be done about it, mainly because at the moment because of I feel like one, people don't really care or would say that there is no time, and the technology is here to maximize the time, especially if it's an AI software or if it's an AI powered biotechnology. And the second is that there is no actual regulations, so the techno optimism takes over the need to evaluate whether
Yeah.
it's actually fitting to the
Yeah.
context. But how do you see perhaps these kind of evaluations taking place at a more like Pan-African level, perhaps?
So I looked into, so there's a whole field, it's part of responsibility and innovation design, technology assessment. You get this whole field of technology assessment that in Africa is, I think, underdeveloped. And once again, I think it's underdeveloped for very specific reasons, right? Because we all know, and I speak of Africa as of like, I know there's a lot behind that, but technologies are being dumped in many contexts. We've seen with Cambridge Analytica and all these kind of ways that technologies have been used in Africa without the proper kind of regulation and frameworks. We've seen a lot of that. And I think something like technology assessment that's huge in Europe, it's huge in America. Like we need to be critically asking, why is this not a big thing on the African continent yet, where we have organizations that assess the technologies before they are introduced, right? And do kind of assessments of the technologies within specific communities. So I think, and I think with the African Union, they did have a paper on this a couple of years ago. So there are things, that it is taking shape, technology assessment on the continent. But I think there's still a long road ahead. I think also this is a big like values in AI or values in technology. This is a big discussion. So also getting like different stakeholders involved in this discussion. So we need the regulators, we need the people on the ground using the technologies, we need the researchers, we need the designers and developers. So facilitating those conversations, I think is quite challenging. I have seen in the last, it's few and far between, but I have seen more attempts at technology assessment structures on the continent. And I mean, I hope that's going to keep on developing in the next couple of years. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful about that. It's something that definitely is starting to take shape. I'm just wish that it would happen quicker, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much, Kristy, for your time and for your really, really valuable contribution and your generosity as well. Please feel free to